On the first day of the annual meeting at the World Economic Forum to hear me talk about art, tech, and consciousness. My name is Samantha Stein. I've been involved with the forum in a few different capacities. I'm a global shaper, and I see some other incredible global shapers in the room. Not only did we just open with a really beautiful mindfulness and visualization exercise led by Megan Dopker, but we also have Julia Bossman in the room, who founded the Red Circle, which is about emotional literacy and emotional first aid. So as I talk in a few minutes about some of the impacts on our health and well-being of technology, Julia is also a pioneer in that space, so I just want to take a moment to recognize that really critical work. So a quick round of applause that we have such incredible minds here. And also just thank you to everyone else who I haven't met yet for being here, and I'm honored that you want to hear a little bit about my background and my journey and experience with these topics. So, as I said, I'm a global shaper as part of the San Francisco hub. I started my career building open source technologies with the purpose of permanently archiving history. So now we talk a lot about blockchain and permanence and being able to verify things, and it's becoming even more important in a time when we're hearing a lot of disinformation and it's not clear what's true and what's not. So today I also have continued on that path. In between that work, I spent time 5 years in the Middle East working on those topics, the Middle East and North Africa. I moved to Silicon Valley, where I helped scale a number of early stage startups to tens of millions of users. I'm a very fierce privacy advocate, and my current work focuses on For art, it focuses on the intersection of technology and consciousness and how technology is impacting us in our human experience. And my art practice is called Wombkind, which I'll share a little bit more about with you. I've also been named a media leader by the World Economic Forum for my former work predicting the startups, trends most likely to become our future reality. So I traveled all over the world and made predictions in just about every market about the really early stage things we were seeing and the particular startups most likely to fulfill those realities. Many of which we're seeing today. We have Cloudflare down the street now on the promenade. It's all around us. So one last thing. Today I'm also the CSO and a tech pioneer for a company called Kedit. And we work on privacy-enhancing technology. And so you see the theme here of privacy as a human right and not a luxury. And I'll talk a little bit about where we've gone in terms of understanding human consciousness, its intersection with technology, how that intersects with privacy, your well-being, and how that is displayed through art. So intention. So Winston Churchill said that intentions are the greatest poetry. And what we can glean from that is it's really important to be conscious, to be aware, to examine how we're using technology, what our intentions are for everything. But when we see technology increasingly omnipresent in our lives, you're all carrying at least one device on you at this moment. There's probably tons of bugs all over this place. And it's really, really important to recognize that when we examine our intentions, even if they're good, there can be unintended consequences. But all tools, and technology as a tool, can be used for good or bad. So it's really important that we have agency in examining our intentions and deciding to use technology for good and safeguarding it. So we need to be able to define words, and words are really, really important forms of symbolism, just like art is. So one of the reasons that we have theoretically human cognition at the level we have is our ability to communicate through language and the symbolism that we imbue language with. We're also at a time where language, much like reality, is becoming more and more confusing. It's hard to understand what things mean. So in the tech world, sometimes our desire to simplify concepts so people can understand them in layman's terms, like referring to a cloud when we mean massive data centers, actually makes people no longer really understand the true meaning of language. So when you say a friend, you might think Facebook friend, and a digital friend, you might think you have thousands. But in reality, it's kind of hollowed out the meaning of friend. And what we're really seeing is that over time, people have less and less human interaction that's nourishing and real, and people are lonelier than ever. It's actually an epidemic. So countries are appointing loneliness ministers. We have horrible rates of suicide that are skyrocketing. So sort of this misinterpretation of language and the misappropriation of it actually becomes really critical to our survival, to rectifying that. So when we talk about intentions, how does it tie to that? And how does it tie to consciousness? So consciousness is our awareness, our sentience that we actually exist. And it's both the most obvious thing to us as humans and the most mystical, the most hard to understand. So philosophers and scientists have debated endlessly what is consciousness. And we actually, to this day, don't know with certainty whether or not it actually exists or is created within the mind or it's something external to us. But we know that we are sentient and that we are aware, and that's part of the human experience. And right now, consciousness is really at an inflection point. So when we think of the word conscious and what consciousness means as we try to understand it, throughout time when we look at technology being used as a tool for good, we've used different words to sort of frame that we're doing that. So we'll say, I'm an impact investor, or this is an impact startup. But the problem with that is what it's really saying is that some technologies are used for good and some technologies don't have an impact. And that's not the case. Everything has an impact, and that might be good, it might be bad. Our intentions might be good, and there might be a negative impact. But another consequence is over time, just like the word friend, these movements actually lose meaning. So sustainable doesn't mean what it used to mean, even though we're at the 2020 meeting for the World Economic Forum, which is all about having a sustainable world, right? We're really focused at this meeting on both security and defense and sustainability and climate change. So other words that have started to lose meaning are, ethical, and now the one that's sort of sweeping to replace sustainable and ethical and impact is conscious. So what does this mean when we're tying our ideas of what consciousness is, what being aware means, to the technologies we use and the prediction that that might actually lose meaning itself? So I talked a little bit about how technology is impacting us. I think an important thing to remember about technology is that the way it's framed today is we largely live in a capitalist world. So if we're talking about wanting technology to be a tool for good and wanting to safeguard that, our actual infrastructure for the way we finance most technologies overwhelmingly doesn't actually set up that incentive structure. So most of our technologies set up an incentive structure where we're actually saying, okay, we're investing in this technology, which means we want the product or service to become a profit center, and then we want that profit center to indefinitely grow until, ideally, the initial investors or the future investors have positive returns. So in a world where data is the new oil, in a world where a lot of our technology is overwhelmingly being used to manipulate our minds, to make us addicted to our phones, to make us feel that constant desire for the dopamine hit. You know what I'm talking about, when you open your phone and you look at the messages even though you don't have notifications, and it's this weird habit and you're like, why am I doing that? Or you feel slight anxiety when your phone's far from you. That's the addiction where actually, neuroscientists who are specialized in neuromodulation and are familiar with how to influence behavioral psychology and your biochemical feedback loops, are actually designing technologies to turn you into a profit center. And this is only increasingly going to be the case. So why is that? The reason that will increasingly be the case is because we're actually having breakthroughs in the field of consciousness right now. So if I'm going to make another prediction about where technology is going, it would be that consciousness is the next frontier for technology. And why is that? The reason why is that technology is increasingly being used as our mediation layer for reality. So we're all around devices all the time. We increasingly have VR, AI, all sorts of things around us. And as it's being used as a mediation layer for reality, the other thing we have to think of is, well, what does that really mean? That means that we're disintermediating reality. And I don't know about you guys, but I think that that's something we need to be really, really mindful, conscious, and aware of. What does it mean to disintermediate reality? It means that in the case of you being a profit center for your subconscious, you're actually letting other people manipulate how you think, or you become a passive thinker. And that's not being conscious, that's not being aware. So one conclusion you would draw is that it's actually the most critical skill of today would be to have a high EQ, a high level of self-awareness, a high level of mind-body attachment. So many people today are trained in our educational systems to be fairly dissociated. So this is where we get to some of my artwork. So this is a piece called Empathogens. And as a technologist, this art is supposed to be a commentary that helps you reconnect to your body. So in person, this abstraction makes your eyes have to focus as the color gradients so that you can't be thinking about other things. You have to focus onto it. And through that, it makes you ground in your bodily experience and awareness. And that might sound like something super basic, but most of us actually are really dissociated from that and don't know how to do that. And that's not our faults. So the way our educational systems work is a lot of our philosophies today, thank you Germany, are based on Waldheimer, which is all about how do we create these efficient, take away holistic approaches, how do we create efficient verticals so that we can increasingly be efficient, create new heights in specific fields and a depth of understanding. And our understanding of truth will be that it's replicable and observable. So a consequence of this is we create a lot of abstractions to understand things, and we've actually, split apart things that were once really understood together. And with those abstractions, we have things like spreadsheets and bottom lines that don't actually account for, well, what's the impact on the environment? Or how do I actually feel in my body about making this business decision? So that's the world we live in. We teach IQ in schools, but we don't teach EQ. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama has recently announced a huge initiative for social emotional learning and that level of intelligence, which I would predict is going to be the most critical intelligence for the future. And it's also one that's a type of sentience and understanding and intelligence that's hard for robots to replicate. So if you're doing robotic tasks right now, leave those to the robots and try to hone your EQ. So my work with Roomkind is how do you actually, looking at where technology is going, how do we actually be mindful of grounding in our interconnectedness to all things? So part of the problem with that abstraction is, and that understanding of the world is it's very mechanistic, right? It's a materialist understanding where we say, okay, like here's the structure, here's the function of everything, and we're breaking it down in these levels of abstractions and these levers. And what's important to examine there is that the repercussion of that is that we might try to solve problems with the exact same systems, just replicating them and looking at new levers. But when you look at underlying problems and we ask, why aren't they being solved? So let's take climate change, for example. We can do a lot of things that are super impactful. Like Winston Churchill in 50 years hence predicted that we would have lab-grown meat. And knowing the impact on the environment of eating red meat, it's a really good lever to pull, but it doesn't change the fact that people still in other ways are being massively unaware of their impact or aware and not caring on the environment, and we're seeing the impacts of that with global warming and all sorts of negative repercussions of climate change. So the next wave of refugees is going to be climate refugees. And the importance here is what I'm trying to show through my work and through us grounding to our bodies and our sense of self is that our minds, this idea of breaking the world down in that way, we forget that our minds exist actually to interpret our bodies. So your actual intelligence is within you. It's those feelings you have that we've dissociated from in this educational system and this viewpoint of the world. And that's your most powerful intelligence. And the impact of that is that's also the intelligence that's rooted in sort of your, what people would call your spirituality, or your feeling of a sense of what's right and wrong and interconnected to all things. So the mind interprets the body. And so that's just a little food for thought about how you're thinking about the world and how you can think about, as people here at the, in Davos, there's so few people in the world. You represent such a small percentage. And I was just with my college roommate right before this, and she said, "Oh, you're going to Davos. Like, you guys are in charge. You're gonna change the world. You're gonna make sure that you really make the biggest impact." So this is a call to action for all of you to remember these things, to remember that this isn't just the way to do things. We've actually constructed the world in a way where we've turned our subconscious essentially now and and using consciousness as the next frontier of technology, if it's a mediation layer, into a profit center. And in doing so, it's Darwinian to be self-aware, or Darwinian to understand our feelings. And to be good leaders, you need to have incredible IQ, EQ and IQ, hopefully, right? But also be good people, right? So how do you do that? You lead with understanding what's right and wrong. You lead with connecting to that. And you have to remember your intentions and make a commitment to safeguard technology and its use for good. So here's another piece of my art that's on mindfulness. So it's not a coincidence that before we see, consciousness as the next frontier take off, which we can credit to things like advances in fMRI technology, where the price has gone way down. We can do a lot more testing and understanding how the brain's working. Some people refer to this space as transformative technologies. That right before this, as our minds are being used as this profit center for all the data and our subconscious thoughts, your digital subconscious, so to speak, and that we're wired towards addiction, and that this is causing mental health issues that are super widespread, that we're seeing unicorn startups that are actually promising to solve these problems, right? Like Calm, and there's a whole suite of them. You can name 100 now. So Mindkino, if you saw the visualization when we opened with, to help you really see a hopefully good, impactful, hopeful future and realize that. So this piece, Brain Falls, is a commentary on art, using art as a medium to express how technology is affecting our minds, and that it's important to clear out these things and to be in control of what we let stay in our mind. Who's controlling it? Is Facebook controlling it with the notifications? Is it some other addiction that you've been wired to through technology? So what's Darwinian to you and will make you the most impactful today is to master your mindfulness. And so that's also right now at this inflection point why we are seeing these technologies take off and all of a sudden it's sort of unicorns. So as we increasingly see technology as this mediation layer for reality, this looks pretty almost like old-fashioned now. It's going to be more and more immersive all around us. So you can sort of predict how those skills become more and more critical. And so why does art matter amongst all of this? So I'd like to share with you sort of two viewpoints. One is by Julia Cameron, which is that, and she wrote this very famous book, which I recommend everyone try to do the exercises in and read if they want to go on this path of really gaining leadership skills and creativity and your EQ, which is that art is the most natural force because it's from creative energy, which is a creation place, which is where we all came from. That's the womb, right? My art practice is called Womb Kind. And in order to harness that, I think it's really important to understand what role we're actually playing, if we're going to be leaders, decision makers, if we're the ones sort of determining reality and then creating it and building it, envisioning it with wonderful, wonderful leaders like Megan Dopker and Mindkino that help us see that and then actualize it. What we need to be aware of is that, artists, creatives, entrepreneurs, they're all visualizing something and then they're pirates of reality, and you all are. Everyone can be that. And it's not that some people have that and some people don't. It's a mindset, and it's training yourself to access that creative energy. So my roommate, as I mentioned, said that my college roommate who's visiting, she's adorable, she's amazing, she really asked me and my friends, like, hey, you're going to Davos, like, you're going to be at this meeting, the world needs a lot more hope. What are you guys going to do to change the future? We have so many problems. And it kind of reminded me of this moment where I was in the Arctic and I was going there with 100 leaders on a boat and we were meeting the top climate change scientists. And we were all expecting they were going to go there, we're going to meet them, they're going to tell us how we're going to deal with this climate change problem and what the situation was. And we got there, and they all turned to us, and they're like, well, we don't know. We're totally lost. Like, this should have been corrected. We're out of advice. Like there's irreversible damage now that's been done. We thought you guys were coming here to help us figure out what to do. And so it was sort of this, like, we were both kind of looking into each other for answers. And it was a really strong reminder that if you're looking to others for answers, it's good to check in, but you have to remember that we are all agents of the future. The kind of mindset you have, the life you're experiencing, the things you're letting go into your mind, these are all your active choices. And when you realize that you're sovereign and you have that agency, you're the one empowered to create the future. And creativity is endlessly important for this and for instilling hope. So I brought my roommate up again and what she said about instilling hope, because my college roommate, she gave this prompt and I thought about it, and I went to the first event of the week, and I asked people what if they had hope and what they were hopeful about and what they were going to do about it, and a lot of people told me they didn't have hope. And if we don't have hope being here, and we're such a small percentage of the world that has the privilege to be here and the privilege to even think about these things and listen and have these kind of conversations, then who are we serving? We're not serving ourselves, and we're not serving the future. So it's important to always have hope and to figure out how to tap into that. So I'd like to end with a story about how you can do that, and then leave you with one of my favorite quotes as an artist and technologist. So fast forward, it's 50 years from now, and disease is rampant, horrible poverty. It's the worst conditions we've ever seen on Earth. People are miserable. It's just, life is like totally brutish and short and horrible. And amongst all of this, a man travels from 100 years in the future back in a time machine. And when he arrives, everyone says, "How did you get here?" He's like, "I'm from the future. I came in my time machine." And they're like, "This is unbelievable. Like, what's it like in the future?" And he tells them, "Oh, the future's incredible. We've cured disease. We've made it so that no one really has to work. They engage in how to really lift humanity and to continue to enlighten themselves and one another, and use their they all realize that they're part of this interconnected superorganism that exists. They're connected to the earth, and they also realize their unique expression and that everyone needs to fulfill that. And they're not tied to the need to work in sort of these old ways of being." People are like, "This is incredible. There's no disease. Like, life is all about fulfilling your purpose. People feel interconnected and full of love and joy and happiness. How did we get there?" He's like, "Oh, well, there's this 12-point plan. I can just write it down and give it to you." He writes it down and he gives it to them. And so he says, "Great, I'll see you in 100 years in the future," and he leaves. So it's 100 years in the future now. It's the anniversary of when the guy came back. There's celebrations everywhere, and a journalist is selected to go and interview this man who traveled from the future. So he goes to interview him. He sits in his place near a fireplace, and he says, like, "You're gonna have, like, how did you do it? And how did you get us here? And we're so happy to be here." And the man from the future says, "I'm on my last days. This might be some of my last moments, and I've really been holding out to see this day. And I need to tell you the true story." And so what he does is he tells him that there was no time machine. In fact, I said I came from the future, and then I went into hiding after I gave you the 12-point plan. It's all in these books right here, all of my philosophies and what the best ways were to get us to the best future possible. And he said, "I want to leave you with how I got there and all of my journals that led me to the 12-point plan, but it was all made up. I didn't know if it would work. Life was better than ever. Everyone was full of joy. There was no disease. It was better than they could have imagined." The journalist sat there in shock. And he says, "I want you to tell them the truth. Tell them my story, that there was no time machine and that it was just a plan that I hoped would work. I just thought if I gave people hope, we'd have a much better future. And that they'd be able to live up to the ways we saw the best possible future in them, in each and every one of them." And as he tells this to the journalist, he slowly passes away. The journalist looks at the notebooks, looks at the man, looks at the fireplace, tosses the notebooks into the fire. So with that, I want to remind you that there's artists within all of you. There's creative energy within all of you. You are the change agents of the present and the future. You're also deciding if you want to let your mind live in the past. And biochemically, when you choose that, your thoughts are actually informing your biochemical makeup. So you really are the agents of so much of your being and the being of people around you in this planet. So one of my favorite quotes by Richter, I'm not good at German, but it's, "Art is the highest form of hope." And so I'll leave you with that. Thank you. And do we need to wrap up, or do we have time for questions? Carl, do you want to do time for questions, or are we good to wrap up?
We have time for like 2-3 questions.
Okay, so we'll do some questions. Does anyone have a question? You are the future, so ask questions.
You were alluding to a book before. Could you give the title?
Yeah, so the book I alluded to, Yeah, so the question was, I mentioned a book in my talk, and it's called The Artist's Way by Julie Cameron. And this book, whether or not you're an artist, helps you understand the spiritual connection to art and how you can unlock your creative forces. And it's very powerful. So one of the exercises, for example, is about morning pages, and you just sit down and write every single morning. And you see over time how sort of these blocks or these ways you stop yourself from expressing are weakened and weakened over time, which is very powerful. Thank you for your question. Oh, Ms. Bossman, what an honor.
You think about the future a lot, and you're an artist. Do you have any thoughts on the future of contemporary art?
So the question was, I think about the future a lot, and I'm an artist. So do I have any thoughts on the future of contemporary art? I do. So it's really interesting. The art world is becoming more and more disrupted right now through technology. So one of the things we're seeing is that people, due to social media and sort of this desire for the dopamine hit and the social capital and the validation through it, are engaging actually more than art than ever. So you're seeing people we used to in many ways think of art, unfortunately, as relegated to the elites, and it was an experience that was consumed at that level. And of course we have museums, but increasingly now what we see instead is that there's museums that are almost created for Instagram or created for sort of immersive experience. And this is attractive to a much wider audience. So some of the largest things we've seen are like Meow Wolf, which is in New Mexico and was a collective of artists who created a space that is now grossing something like $9 million a year and has expanded to other places, and people from all over the country, all types of people come in and see that. And then you have, other immersive experiences like the Museum of Ice Cream, which is also a startup that I believe has raised over like $100 million. In terms of more traditional art that we think of as contemporary, there's artists like Yayoi Kusama, who I believe is the highest grossing female artist alive, who does these light boxes, these infinity boxes. And she was like really interesting. One of the things that happened as a consequence is it was one of the first times we saw exhibits at museums where the tickets were being scalped. So I think in terms of art, we're seeing a lot more people engage with it, and we're seeing that sort of secondhand engagement through posts online. We're seeing a lot of new tools used, so you can use AI and VR and a lot of different technological mediums in art, and that's only going to increase. I love using tilt brush and creating like paintings all around me that I can kind of like sit in and live in. So a lot of really interesting things are happening. Thank you for your question. Wonderful. Thank you all so much.